Today, we're going to be talking about generational trauma, and I've been seeing a lot online about it and social networking especially, and there's a lot of illustrative ideas and examples of what generational trauma is and what generational trauma healing looks like with different examples. So we're going to be diving into that because generational trauma often connects to our finances, and it even stems sometimes from the financial situations of people in our past. My name is Michelle Pava. You are listening to the Finance Therapist Podcast. If you have a question for me, go over to my website, thefinancetherapist.com, and go ahead and go to the contact form and ask a question and say, hey, can you answer this on your podcast? So, that said, let's start talking about generational trauma. Now, number one, I'm going to just say it, and I mean it when I say it. I think the popularity of generational trauma and discussing generational trauma is often because people want to push the blame for what they're going through and their actions and their behaviors on someone else. Every single coping strategy that we have, we developed because of our environment, that environment being our family, the food we eat, or our friends, or politics, whatever. Nothing is 100% from us. So everything technically can be blamed on someone else. And I totally understand that if you had a very traumatic childhood, you're going to have a lot more work and a lot more pain that you have to go through to get to a place of peace. I am not discounting that. However, I also feel that there are plenty of people that use generational trauma as a phrase that they throw around to take away the accountability that they have on themselves. So let's look at one of the examples that I saw recently on TikTok. No, actually it was Instagram. And it was 4 glasses of water. Okay, so I want you to imagine 4 glasses of water in front of you. But the last one is labeled great grandmother. And that one is very muddy and murky. And then you pour that muddy murky into the grandmother glass. And that one is going to be murky and dirty. And then you take that one and you pour it into the third glass, which is the mom. And so the mom one is very murky. But then she goes to, and I'm using air quotes, therapy and self-help. And that is represented by clear water being poured into the dirty water. And it's overflowing and it's very illustrative. It's just very dramatic. And there's just dirty water everywhere, but the glass is becoming more and more clear. And then there's a smaller glass next to it that represents you or your child. And you take that cleaner or clean water from the mom and you pour it into the child. And that, they say, is how you heal generational trauma. Wouldn't it be great if it was really like that? So the metaphor of generational trauma being muddy water that becomes sparkly clear after healing suggests an overly simplistic and unrealistic view of trauma and its resolution. This myth can be dangerous for several reasons, and I'm going to get into them right now. Number one, it's oversimplifying it. Trauma, especially generational trauma, is complex and it is multifaceted. Simplifying it to a quick fix solution underestimates the deep and ongoing nature of trauma and also how much work has to go into it. And it requires nuanced and sustained efforts to address. So when you go to therapy because you don't feel good or you're having a topical problem, you may think that when you start to feel better because of the problem, then you're healed. But ongoing trauma therapy is much more than just having bad days and rectifying those bad days. And I know a lot of you already know this, but some people don't. And that's why I'm doing this podcast. There's also false expectations. So this idea that there's going to be a sparkly clear outcome sets unrealistic expectations. When individuals do not achieve this perfect state, they might feel discouraged, they might blame themselves, or they believe that they have failed or that therapy doesn't work. And this can actually make the whole situation worse. So that's not good. Then there's also the commercializing of healing, which is so big online. This myth is often used to sell quick fix solutions and products or programs that promise easy and immediate results. this commercialization and the marketing can exploit the vulnerable. And especially if these people are seeking relief and they are leading them to spend money in ineffective or superficial solutions. And that is incredibly bothersome to me because this is also a flavor of financial abuse. So then there's also neglecting long-term work. So of course, when I'm looking at a video and you're seeing the very dramatic pouring of the water and the water's overflowing and then it gets clear, that's neglecting the long-term work. What they're not telling you about that water that's being poured in is that is from the time you were a child to now. So if you as an adult are going to therapy, which is great, and you're hoping to maybe help your children who are in elementary school or high school, or maybe they're infants even, you're already programmed. You're already programmed in your trauma, in your coping strategies. So yeah, you're going to improve, but you're not curing, and I'm using air quotes here, you're not curing the generational trauma. So you've already relayed some of that to your children, or maybe you haven't. Maybe it's not as bad as you think, or maybe you've already developed coping strategies that are functional. So don't discount, number one, your own work, and also don't discount that it is also long-term work when you are really involved in true healing, involving ongoing work, including therapy, self-reflection, adapting coping strategies that are more functional. By promoting a quick fix, though, this myth can divert attention from the long-term commitment needed for genuine progress and resilience. Also, ignoring systemic issues. So generational trauma is not only an individual issue, but it's a society one, right? So a quick fix solution is often ignoring the larger systemic factors such as social inequalities and cultural pressures and all of these things that contribute to trauma. So if you are of a certain culture, race, gender, there's just so many different cultural society oppressions that even if you are working on what happened in your home, what happened in your home might have happened because of past cultural oppressions. So you're not going to really get out of, therapy and suddenly you're going to walk into a world where everyone is accepting everyone. You're still going to have the same stuff. So it's more important to have the coping strategies, but not think of it as a cure. Does that make sense? So I want you to really think about having effective healing requiring broader issues, okay? So you're not just healing what mom or dad did, even if you think it's isolated, even if it was a very targeted abuse towards you that you are healing and you know that they had targeted abuses towards them, you have to look at the big picture. Why was that? Was it lack of medication? Was it lack of education? Was it lack of support? And are these things still prevalent in our society? So I'm not trying to be negative, and we're going to get positive really soon, but I just want to bring some of these things up so you can understand that it's not as easy as just, oh, now I'm going to have therapy, and now the water glass is clear, and now my kids are great. And there's another topic that I want to add to that, by the way. So there's also intergenerational dynamics. So trauma and its effects are woven into family dynamics and cultural context. So healing your trauma doesn't automatically clear the path for the next generation. So let me explain that one. So each generation does face its own challenges and it has to engage in its own healing processes. So even if you're healing your generation and your healing processes because of what you've been exposed to and your support system, it doesn't mean that you just gave a clear path to the next generation. Just like if you're pregnant, say, and you eat really healthy, and then your child is 15 years old and they suddenly don't eat healthy. The fact that you ate healthy before doesn't make their entire life just this piece of cake, no pun intended with unhealthy eating. But you know what I'm saying, right? They have to go through their own stuff. And sometimes when you're healing, it is also that you're bringing to the table some of your own stuff that you don't recognize. A lot of times we don't recognize our stuff. And so, yeah, you might be healing from what mom or dad did to you, or grandmom or grandpop did to you, or you saw 3 generations do. But it doesn't mean that the things that are in your blinders that you can't see, that are outside of your blinders, excuse me, it doesn't mean that those things are healed. So that is still generational pain, right? So it doesn't mean that just because you're working on your stuff, that your children will not have stuff, is all I'm saying, okay? But I also want to go backwards a little bit here. Sometimes the things that really bothered you are not going to bother other people. There are things that I am very sensitive about that other people in my family just go, not a big deal. And it's not because they're discounting what upsets me. It's just because we all have different triggers or different sensitivities. And I want to just say a quick word here about triggers. Triggers are, that's an overused word. Triggers and sensitivities are two different things. A sensitivity is like, I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but it's not going to rock my world. It's not going to stop my day. Did I just sound totally 1980s there when I said rock my world? Or was that 90s? I apologize. I am a child of the 80s. Anyway, so when you have this idea that everything's a trauma, then you're making everything bigger than it has to be. Everything isn't a trigger. A trigger is something that stops you from living. So, for instance, if I don't like elevators, and I'm a little sensitive to it, I'm a little uncomfortable with it, but I still go on elevators and sometimes I don't even think twice about it, then that's just a slight sensitivity. It's just a slight discomfort. But when someone says, I'm triggered by this, I'm triggered by that. Well, triggered means you can't get on an elevator, or you get on an elevator and you're breathing into a brown paper bag, right? Like, being triggered means you are now not really in the most functional space. So saying that you're triggered over everything is actually taking away the severity when people are actually triggered and they bring up like, hey, I'm being triggered right now. So we have to stop using triggered all of the time. But you can be triggered, or you can be just sensitive to something. So something that you're triggered by, maybe they're just sensitive to, or they're not even noticing, and that's okay. Also, not every uncomfortable or bad experience that you had in your life is technically a trauma. Now, we call them traumas because we never know how someone is reacting or coping initially. But sometimes really bad things happen to you, and guess what? You're resilient. And you're more resilient maybe than you think, and you're still able to get up in the morning and go and do things and have functional relationships and loving relationships and accept love and give love and be successful and still, take a shower, wash your hair, and do all the things that you need to do to be a functional person. The thing that happened might have some bad memories to it, but it doesn't stop you. Therefore, it's a little gray area if it's truly a trauma to you or a really bad experience. So also understand, not everything is a trauma, not everything is a trigger. But when we understand these complexities, especially with generational trauma or generational discomfort, then we understand the realities of healing. So I want to talk about some different possibilities for healing now, okay? So there is the awareness and acknowledgement that there is a presence and an impact of generational trauma. That's the first step. That's the first step towards healing. It doesn't mean blaming. Now, there's a part of your healing that does acknowledge that, yes, I didn't deserve this, and you're going to go ahead and blame and point the finger and get mad and do whatever you need to do in the comfort and safety and protection of the therapy room, okay, or the therapist. So I want you to understand that acknowledging and being aware are really important parts of the healing process. But then you also need therapeutic interventions. And let me just backtrack. This is also why I'm not a huge fan of the kind of programs that are very disconnected. So, for instance, if you go on TikTok, you will see hundreds and hundreds of narcissist abuse coaches. And all they do, they'll say things like, here's the top 3 things that you have to look for in a narcissist, or here's the 3 things that a narcissist says that really gets under your skin, or here's 5 things that you should look at as red flags in a narcissist. And they just keep doing this fear factor over and over. And that is not a therapeutic intervention. That's a warning. And their pages are nothing but red flags, which is fine for awareness and acknowledgement. But there's 2 things to look at. does that therapist or coach seem to be moving forward in life? Are they developing relationships? Are they in some way showing you the other side of healing? Or is everything about what they are speaking of the doom and gloom? So that's one thing. And if it's all doom and gloom, you don't want that. There's that phrase of, I think it's Jim, I forget his last name. He says, you are like the 5 people you spend the most time with. Well, if your guru is doom and gloom all of the time, not so good, okay? Then you don't need your telomeres, the little areas of your brain that need to be resilient, to break down because of the negativity, because they don't build back up again, right? You need someone that has some level of looking at the silver lining. And there are people out there like that. So awareness and acknowledgement is very different than therapeutic interventions. And the reason why I'm bringing up so much with social networking is because so many people are on social networking. So professional therapy is highly effective in addressing generational trauma. So these techniques will take time though. Okay, so expect to spend a couple of years probably in therapy at least, with CBT, psychodynamic work, trauma-focused therapies like EMDR, which I absolutely love, somatic experiencing. All of these different things can help individuals process and integrate traumatic experiences. So let's go into developing resilience. So when you have the awareness, and then we go to the therapeutic interventions, now what we're doing is, as we're doing these interventions, we're looking at resilience. So building resilience involves developing your coping strategies and emotional regulation skills. These will help you to manage stress better and any of the trauma triggers that you might have, or uncomfortable situations or memories that you might have. And this reduces the impact of generational trauma. So being able to take a step back and not be affected so much is really important. And that's not going to look like a clear glass of water. You're still going to have the mud in front of you. You're still going to have that, but it's going to be a little different. And my feeling actually is really different about the whole muddy water thing. Coming from someone with a very strong Buddhist background, I look at the mud as a fertile space to grow. I don't see it as we need to get rid of it. I don't see it as we have to pretend it's not there. I see it as, okay, well, how can we use this to our benefit? How can we twist this energy into something else? And I feel like that's a much easier way to look at our pain and our suffering. So we also have to look at family therapy. So when it's possible, generational trauma affects entire families. So if one person in the family is suffering and only one person is going to therapy, then we have to understand the dynamics of the other people. And we have to understand the communication and the unhealthy patterns. In a lot of families that suffer, I've noticed that there's one person that just wants to fix everyone, and they want everyone to be happy because they had a very unhappy childhood. And so when they become the fixer and everyone has to be happy, they are losing a lot of themselves. And they also become very codependent, where everybody else's happiness is what factors into when they're happy or not, right? So the more that they can develop their own hobbies and their own happiness, the more they break away from having to feel that they have to fix everyone else. And then a lot of those unhealthy patterns then also start to disintegrate. Now, sometimes they escalate first because all the people that were being taken care of suddenly have to take care of themselves. And as you can imagine, that causes a little bit of turmoil. So family therapy is a great idea, but when that's not possible for whatever reason, and I would never suggest to anyone to push anyone into therapy, it's a good idea just to work on your own patterns. And so that helps with generational trauma, because when you make a change, it is a domino effect with everyone around you. And this changes your money story. This changes their money story. Now, for them, it could go bad or it could go good, but it's not your thing, right? So family therapy is really important in generational trauma, including financial therapy. Then there's cultural and community support. This is where you are not isolating and you're engaging with the cultural community resources that can help you to provide a sense of belonging or support. This might look like going to church, synagogue, or sangha. This might look like, or any place of worship. This might look like being involved in your local high school alumni group, or a lot of different things. There's a lot of different groups, book groups, or just getting together with neighbors, just having that support of people beyond just friendships. Friendships are great, and I want you to have them, but I want you to go beyond your friendships to an eclectic group of people that have similar interests. That really helps with generational trauma and generational struggles, because it helps to open your eyes to new ways of living, and it helps you to see groups that are facing similar systemic and historical traumas. And usually they're pretty vocal about it. And in a very, I should say they're vocal about it in a very passive way. So, for instance, in a church group, you might hear a lot of stories of people's childhoods and what brought them to the church. And so those are giving you clues on what someone as a group, or what the group has been through. Anyway, mindfulness and self-care. I know these words are thrown around so much that they become background noise, but practices like mindfulness, meditation, self-care, these can help you manage stress and foster a sense of well-being, and institute and initiate healing, physical healing as well. These practices promote emotional healing and resilience. And then the last thing, which is really important, is education and advocacy. This is where you're learning about the historical and systemic roots of generational trauma. That alone can help empower you as an individual to make more sense of what has happened. Now, in some types of traumas, that's just not going to happen. Some traumas are just hideous, and there will never be a sense of, oh, I get it. That won't always happen. But you can at least understand where maybe you are more heard than maybe 2 generations ago that might have had the same type of trauma. Maybe you have more opportunities to heal. And that alone, understanding the historic value of that, can be empowering. And then you can take the broader healing initiatives and feel more empowered with that. So now I want to go and I want to look at some of the limitations and some of the realities of true generational trauma. There is no complete erasure of this situation. While significant healing is possible, completely erasing the impact of generational trauma may not be a realistic goal. The scars of trauma can leave lasting marks, even as individuals learn to cope and thrive. Just acknowledging that is very important. So if you're always looking at this magical clear glass where there's no scars and everything's perfect and it's like Disneyland, you're probably going to feel like you're not enough, or that you're never going to get better. When the reality is if you can understand that sometimes when you get hurt, there's a scar. It doesn't mean that you're still walking around with the injury. It just means that the remnants of the injury are reminders, but it doesn't mean that you're hindered anymore in life. So understanding that the scars of trauma can leave lasting marks is a very big part of coping and thriving. So it's an ongoing process as well. Healing is always ongoing. It's a lifelong process because every single day we're aging. We have new transitions and experiences, and society changes every day. There's not a day that we wake up and everything's perfect and we're 10 years younger and wiser, okay? So it requires continuous effort, self-reflection, adaptation. Progress is non-linear, so there's going to be periods of improvement and there's going to be setbacks. That setbacks do not mean that you're at square one. It just means it's a setback because that's life. Every day we have different resilience as well. If you didn't eat that great last night, today you might not feel as good, right? So that happens emotionally as well. Later in the day, if you have something really stressful that happens later in the day where you're already exhausted, you're going to feel it more because your resilience is lower, okay? So understand that it's an ongoing process. You're going to have periods of improvement. You're going to feel great. You might be tempted to stop therapy, stop your self-healing, stop your reflection. Please don't, because there's setbacks and we always want to build our resilience. And then we have to look at systemic factors. This is a reality. Generational trauma is often intertwined with systemic issues such as racism, poverty, inequality. And so addressing these broader factors is essential for long-term healing, but it's beyond the control of you or your therapist or whatever. It's you can't control it. So you have to understand that these happen. Also, there's intergenerational dynamics. Now, this is a biggie, so please pay attention to this one above everything else. Each generation has to engage in its own healing work. So the healing that you're doing from what you may think is your mom, your grandmom, your great-grandmom, your great-grandfather, whoever, that's your work. And it helps your children, but it doesn't make the glass sparkly clean for them because every generation has their own healing work. And like I said earlier, you may have blinders on to your own stuff, and your children are actually, when they get to be adults, if they're not already, they may think, hey, I need to do some work on myself because my mom was a hot mess, my dad was a mess. And meanwhile, you're not seeing it at all. So we often don't notice our own stuff. And so every generation has to engage in their own healing work because the efforts of one generation can create a healthier foundation for the next, and each new generation will actually still face its own challenges, and it has to have its own resilience. So part of healing generational trauma is not trying to control your children's outcomes. You want to be there, you want to be supportive, you want to be that nest that they can land in, but you don't want to be their wings where you're flying for them, right? They need to learn how to fly on their own, and they need to want to come back, right? So you have to remember that you working on you is about being the best you that you can be. It's not making sure that their glass is crystal clear. Do not live for someone else. Live for you, be the best that you can be for other people, but you cannot live for them. So completing healing generational trauma in the sense of making the past vanish isn't possible. But significant progress can be made in transforming the way trauma impacts you and your family, and through awareness and interventions, resilience, what else did I say? Community, family support, if you have it, and community support, which I just said, actually is going to help mitigate the negative effects of generational trauma, create healthier outcomes, healthier patterns for future generations. And then the journey of healing is complex. We know that. So we can respect that, right? We are complex individuals. We're complex as a family. We're complex as a group, as a culture. So we keep going on and on and on, and you can see how intertwined it is. And I do feel that we are all interconnected. So we can make meaningful change if we all work on each other, ourselves, I should say, if we all work on ourselves a little bit more every day and just focus on being the best that we can be. So I know that you probably did have generational trauma if you're listening to this, or you may realize that, well, maybe I didn't have generational trauma, but it doesn't matter what the label is. The only thing that matters is that you are being the absolute best person that you can be. And so when you're doing that, you are also working on your financial self, your emotional self, your physical self. Don't let anything drop, okay? You don't have to do one thing 100%, although you may want to focus in different areas at different times of your life. But sometimes you focus on the emotional, sometimes you focus on the financial. But this is also why just focusing on dollars and cents of a budget doesn't always work. Because if you have all this other stuff that is interconnected with who you are as a person, you need to take mind of that. You need to bring it all together. So if you are dealing with generational trauma, if you are dealing with something painful that happened in your life, you need to hold your own hand, and you need to also hold your own wallet, and you need to make sure that you are putting the boundaries up for your money as you're learning to put the boundaries up for yourself, so that you have the means to help yourself more, and even your children maybe in the future, and leave a legacy of love. My name is Michelle Pava. You've been listening to the Finance Therapist podcast, and I would love for you to follow along and give me a like if you can. Also, go to my website. I have free resources for you, thefinancetherapist.com. And I'll talk to you next time.